The webinar is being live streamed.
Is that what it says?
Yeah, it just hasn't launched YouTube yet.
Okay. Once it does, we'll send Sarah what she needs. And all the right computers will talk to each other.
It's showing you me. So let's make sure this is spotlit for everybody. Yeah, it's weird that it's only showing. This is on a significant delay.
Most working has able to join.
Oh, good.
Oh, and use.
Oh, here it goes.
Yeah.
Yep, here it goes. It was just on a delay.
Okay. So
Yes.
embed code to Sarah.
Embed code to Sarah.
Next step.
So embed code. Copy. I think I'll use the same thread as yesterday. Let's see. There she is. There she is. I'll include the share link because I think they used that last time as a backup. See if that came through.
Yeah, you don't have to. You don't have to lurk. It'll probably take Sarah's 2 minutes to hook it up. But yeah, in my mind, this can all just stay up and running.
Yeah. If we have to test anything, I'll black out the screen, but then I'll make sure this goes right back up.
Okay.
So
You should also make sure I know Zoom has a thing where it's like if it's inactive for a certain amount of time, it just automatically ends the meeting. I don't know if YouTube has anything like that, but maybe we turn the video feed on at like 3:45.
Sure. Yeah, we can swap. Yeah. Well, at least we're sending a signal no matter what. It just happens to be a slide right now, but that is a live video feed.
Okay, cool.
Because I can use I can go like this, and now you're seeing the podium for a few seconds and then coming back. So
cool. I'm just
no, it's good. Believe me.
Please.
Oh wait, speaking of every eventuality,
Yeah.
just as a heads up. So we had this with an event recently where because the dancers have music accompaniment.
Yeah.
Zoom sometimes handles that well and sometimes it does not.
Yeah.
So I have it set up for professional original. It's called original sound for musicians is on, which it should not try to filter out music, but it might still because it's coming through the board.
Yeah.
I'm gonna hopefully that won't be the case. Worst case, they're gonna still see the visuals of the dancers. They just may not hear the music, or it might be choppy.
If I'm some random person watching on Zoom and the audio of the music is weird, that seems pretty understandable.
Right, but we have everything set up on our end to hopefully not have that not be the case. But sometimes it just depends on the type of music. At least there's no voices in the music, so that's a good thing. But we'll hopefully it comes through.
Okay, thanks Gino. Thanks for everything.
You know what I might have? Do you have a computer with you or just your phone?
I have an iPad.
Oh, iPad. Maybe I'll have them send us the live stream, like the page when it's up and running, and we can have that as like a secondary thing going just to make sure it all looks good. Yeah. Because I don't want to keep it running in the background here and get confused. I have too many windows open. I just want the Zoom running off of here.
Yeah.
Zoom audio check. 1, 2. Now if I actually open the mic.
Zoom check. 1, 2.
Excellent. We have audio. So have I showed you the microphone trick for locking these on?
No.
So if you ever find yourself lighting somebody up ahead of time, which is what we normally do, when you go to switch it on, just open this up, hold the up arrow, and switch it on, and the 2 little lock symbols will appear, so they can't accidentally shut themselves off.
Oh, cool.
So, and then if I need to unlock it, you put it in the on position, do the same thing, switch it over, and then it'll turn off, and then you can actually switch it off that way.
Cool.
So it's up arrow in both directions for locking it.
Do you always do that when you hand it over to them?
Yeah, because I can't tell you how many times people
I'm
either
sure.
think they're supposed to turn themselves on,
Of
or it's
course.
like in their pocket.
Yeah.
Like I'd rather get in trouble for forgetting to turn it off here.
Yeah. Amicad guest, right? Is the Wi-Fi I should connect to?
Yes, the password's really long now.
I think I'm.
Maybe you've already been connected.
I think I saw it at a previous event.
I thought I could test that music one more time.
That night, and the reason is I'm using a friend's lens,
Oh,
and I just feel like I'll feel better.
You got it. Don't worry about it.
Especially for that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure any of that's going to come through or not.
Even source of 4, right?
Yeah. I wonder if the board does something to it. Or
Could production world use anything from us at all? Do you guys need anything?
Oh, you're the best, man. Do you need water or anything? You good?
I'm good,
All right.
yeah.
Yeah, I just got my water. So.
Sweet.
Yeah, thank you.
Let us know.
Appreciate it. Oh, now you've done it.
Oh, I
Yeah.
you know what? Maybe I should just take that down. Oh, I need to take what I
Come on, is camera 5 on the screen there now?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's the one time I'd love to have you go out to the camera temporarily is when the dancers start, and just figure out a nice shot for that. I'll keep it on like the wide from the side until we get it in focus.
And honestly, the way you have to set them up right now is probably fine.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. We'll see if that holds up. Then otherwise we'll adjust it.
If we realize that they're dancing inside the bounds of it, we can always cut to something else and
Yeah.
go back.
So I'll cue up 7 here to be a little wider. On the
Yeah.
side.
an exciting 2.5 days here. So I'm just going to cover some logistics here and then we'll get started. One of the most important announcements is where the bathrooms are, and the restrooms are to the left near the front entrance. Emergency exits and fire alarm, they're pull stations, and the exits are near the front and rear of the building. And really important that this is a historic place, so please be respectful of the space, no moving of furniture, artwork, or wandering into other rooms. Certainly we're fortunate to have interpreters here, as you can see, right next to us. So please, if you need some assistance there, feel free to reach out to them. We also have a lot of nice, bright young STS fellows around. They will have a red badge on that says "Ask Me." Please feel free to ask them anything you're interested in. Of course, logistics are important, but they're wonderful young scholars and would love to talk to you as well. And so, you know, I'll preview a little bit of what's coming today. And we have exciting 2 days after today as well. But right now, we'll have a little introduction to the observatory project. Will be followed by a very exciting Pigeonwing Dance Company performance at 4:30. Then we have an opening panel at 5 o'clock, followed by a reception at 6:30. And please do try to stay for a very exciting film screening called Unspeakable Conversations. That is a special screening as well as a conversation with the playwright that will be happening right here. And so that should give you an idea of today's agenda. We're just thrilled that everyone is in this space and joining us online. And I will hand it over to my co-organizer, Professor Sheila Jasanoff.
Thank you, Chris. The term triumvirate comes up in two different ways in the course of this meeting. One is that there are three of us co-organizers who've been involved in this project for more years than I can remember, but the other is that one of our sponsors and patrons, my good friend John McQuillan, runs a company called Triumvirate. So all good things come in threes, and we'll be hearing more from John later. What I wanted to do is give you a collective sense of what it means to have a project at all, and a little bit about the background that helps contextualize what we're trying to do in this particular meeting. So what you see going across the screen is a set of posters from prior events that we have hosted. But in a way, the history of all of this goes back even before my days at Harvard, way back to Cornell University, where a program on biology and society was founded back in the late 1960s for pre-med students who wanted to take society first, in a sense. So my own entry into the field of STS and all of my intellectual thinking about STS was formed in the shadow of there already being a thing called biology and society, and therefore an acknowledgement that developments in science and technology, particularly in the life sciences and technologies, had to go hand in hand with developments in social understanding and regulation and bioethics and so on. So I worked at Cornell for 20 years, during which time I established a Department of Science and Technology Studies. Our undergraduate major was called Biology and Society. We developed eventually a training grant to produce PhDs in this field who were working in biology and society. And then when I came to Harvard, I had the good fortune to continue with that project. And in fact, both Ben Hurlbut and Chris Saha, cycled through that program and are every much products of the program as now architects and co-designers of it. So that's something like 40 years of evolution, thinking about the interface between biology and social science, humanities, ethics, and, you know, both how to develop that frontier and what it means for society. So back in the 20-teens, roughly, when genome editing became a thing for the first time, there was this sudden upsurge of excitement, as there always is. I mean, you know, right now, the most recent arrival that's causing those kinds of waves in the world is probably DeepSeek, but before DeepSeek, there was ChatGPT. I mean, so every time people feel that a technological frontier is breaking, there is this kind of excitement. Let's follow that thing. And suddenly the whole world is supposed to organize itself around that thing. I think the position that the observatory takes is, no, that's not right. That there was law, there was public policy, there was moral thought, there were preoccupations, there were social arrangements, long predating the newest developments in science and technology, and therefore that if we as societies are going to competently respond to these frontiers of development, then we need to go back to our moral understandings, the things, the questions, the kinds of preoccupations into which the scientific and technological innovations land. We have been extremely fortunate in being able to attract other people to believe in us and in our project, and you will hear a little bit more about the particular sponsors and patrons and people to whom we must give thanks when Ben follows me. But already in 2017, we decided to organize a meeting here on the heels of what was then the first International Summit on Genome Editing. That happened in 2015, and it was hosted by the US National Academy of Sciences. It was a very important occasion, and several of you in this room were present at it. But it was already clear that a certain set of questions would be on the table and other questions would not be on the table. So very much people were going out of the editing metaphor. I don't know how often between roughly 2015 and 2020, I heard people saying that genome editing is just like spell check. I should ask you to raise your hands if you've heard that metaphor. But, you know, it isn't just like spell check. For one thing, you run spell check on some, you know, casual thing you're producing on your laptop and not on human bodies and human cells. So it's not just like spell check. But nevertheless, there was that kind of taken for grantedness about what genome editing was. And our feeling was that the kinds of questions we needed to ask and the kinds of issues we needed to raise far transcended that, you know, set of observations. So we had that meeting in 2017, and you know, one of our very prominent colleagues, Eric Lander, said to us that if we really felt strongly about this, we should organize an alternative. And then these things crystallized back in 2023, a couple of years ago, when the three national scientific communities that had begun organizing these international summits had the third meeting in London. So this was held at the Francis Crick Institute in 2023. And at the very end of it, people asked Robin Lovell Badge, the organizer of the meeting, well, is there going to be another one? And he said, well, we scientists only ever agreed to having 3, and if anybody wants to have the 4th or the 5th, that they're absolutely welcome to. And for Lord of the Rings aficionados in this audience, I felt that this was the Rivendell moment. You know, everybody was silent. Whose job was it going to be to have the next summit? And Frodo stands up, and think of us as the Frodo of the bioethics enterprise. We have about as many resources. I don't know if we have hair between our toes, but in any case, we decided that if there was going to be a serious turning of the mirror around to ask the societal questions that need to operate as the frame for biotechnological innovation, then we would try to construct that meeting. And you are all here as part of that initiative. And I welcome you, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben Hurlbut to make the official round of thank yous.
Triumvirate is the hobbits. Sheila is definitely Frodo. Chris is Merry, and I guess I get to be Pippin. And Jacob, who I will thank momentarily, is our Sam. But of course, the hobbits had their Aragorn, and I'm not enough of an aficionado to list off the rest of them. And so I have the privilege of giving the thanks to the many people who are and organizations that are behind the capacity to convene what I hope will be a very important and meaningful set of conversations over the next couple of days. And so one more little bit of history. When we undertook this 2017 meeting, it was easy to have the idea. It was hard to gather the resources to put it together. And we relied on people to get their own organizations to pay their way to some extent. And we went around hat in hand and begged dribs and drabs from various different organizations who believed very enthusiastically in the undertaking, but only were prepared to put a little bit of money where their mouths were. And the one exception there actually was the Templeton Foundation, which quite quickly provided us with a reasonably significant chunk of support for that. And when we produced a proposal for an observatory, which was very enthusiastically received, but of course we had no resources to do anything except pen a proposal. We went around searching for support, and we found it almost nowhere with the exception of the John Templeton Foundation, who very generously has supported this initiative over the course of the last 5 years. And so I want to begin with the acknowledgement, recognition, and sincere gratitude to the Templeton Foundation, which is relatively unique in the world of philanthropy in the sense that they are prepared to fund ideas. And believe that ideas have consequences, and therefore are prepared to put resources into their formation and development. For this particular component of the observatory's work, however, it would also not have been possible without the enormous generosity of John McQuillan, who you will hear from a little bit later, in endowing the McQuillan Institute for Science, Technology, and the Human Future. And so I won't say more than an enormous expression of gratitude to that institute and to its founding funder, because you will hear more in due course. There have been a host of people who have made, who have done the enormous amount. I was ignorant of I've organized a lot of things with our triumvirate, but I think I was ignorant of the level of energy that was going to be required to undertake something of this scale. And yet it was made possible by a group of people in the background sending innumerable emails, working out, an infinite number of details and so forth. And so first I want to thank Henry Austin, who I think many of you know as an email persona, Dan Afsprung, who joined the team this year, Catherine Helms, who is also an addition this year, Laura Flynn, who makes the trains run on time in the STS program here at Harvard, the small army of STS fellows, who I don't have time to name one by one, but you will meet wandering around here over the course of the next 3 days. I also want to thank the staff of the Norton Woods Conference Center. What a beautiful venue this is. And they've made it available to us over the course of the next 3 days, in particular, Joni Adrich and Gino Beniamino, who is making all of the AV happen. And I want to thank our ASL interpreters, Audrey Bastian and Sambia Shivers. Thank you. Okay, then the people back of the design of this thing. There is, of course, the little group of hobbits here, and I've mentioned Jacob Moses, who is over here, who also joined the effort this year, and has been an extraordinarily valuable contributor to this undertaking. But in particular, I want to name, and I actually want to name by name, the members of our organizing committee. So we convened really an all-star team in we recognize the need for a brain trust that went far beyond the limits of the imaginations of the triumvirate. And we convened an all-star team who've been extraordinarily dedicated, including to the point of a few months ago traveling from very distant places to spend several days with us, just basically brainstorming who should be here and how the program should be designed and so on and so forth. I think as you'll see, this program is a somewhat complex choreography because the spirit of this undertaking is to convene unlikely conversation partners, non-obvious conversation partners around questions where the members of those panels may themselves be scratching their heads about why they are all assembled together. But we believe that those forms of juxtaposition and engagement will achieve precisely the forms of expanded conversation that it is the mission of the Global Observatory to engender. And so I want to thank the organizing committee for all of the contributions to thinking through this effort, in particular, Françoise Baylis, John Evans, Douglas Kaiser, Catherine Littler, Laurence Lavoff, Pete Mills, Genevieve Halke, Matt Porteous, Carter Sneed, Kaushik Sundarajan, David Winikoff, and Carrie Wolnitz. I didn't name their affiliations for the sake of time, but please look them up. It is an extremely impressive group of people. I also want to thank the various groups who have joined in the effort here. So we wanted to make this an inclusive space in which ideas and perspectives would have a presence, even a formal presence, to allow for engagement of forms that might not take place if they weren't given a spot. So there are tables that are out in the atrium that will have various contributions from scholars and from organizations and so forth. And in particular, the Bioscience Resource Center was right there by the check-in. And I think many people have already bumped into that table and looked at some of their materials. Please be sure to peruse it during the coffee hour. On Friday, we have a special lunchtime session that is convened by the Center for Genetics and Society. And this evening in particular, as Chris noted, we have two artistic contributions to the conversation. There is the expression of ideas in the kind of pointy-headed modes of the scholar, but there is also the forms of artistic expression that are necessary elements in engendering the form of reflection and conversation that it is the project of this meeting to contribute to. And so we will have a dance performance shortly. And then after this evening's panel and a reception that is good, which hopefully will be substantial enough to serve as a kind of dinner for everybody, we hope you will all come back to a very special event, which is a screening of a recording of a theatrical performance. We really wanted to have it done live, but the actors were unavailable. And yet the recording is really exceptional. And the title of this play, quite appropriately, is Unspeakable Conversations. The project of this meeting is to have unlikely conversations among unlikely conversation partners to render what has been unspoken spoken, and even to render what has been unspeakable spoken, in order that the difficult questions in play can be encountered and contended with properly. And so it's in that spirit that we have brought in this performance and the playwright, the author of this drama that you will hear from later. Last but not least, I want to thank the many colleagues and friends who are in the room here. This is, again, a space of conversation which will hopefully engage everyone who's here. And so your participation is essential. And many of you, I think, know each other from prior observatory convenings. And so the spirit of engagement and of sustained engagement that persists well beyond the limits of any given convening. That is our project here. So I want to thank you in advance for contributing to advancing that project. So with that, let me turn it over to Sheila to say a few words and introduce John McQuillan.
So one of the things that Ben didn't explicitly mention is that we're told all the time that we're turning from being a verbal culture to a visual culture. Certainly 20 years ago, well, maybe it was around 23 years ago that somebody told me, if you're going to have a program, you have to have a website. And I'm not sure I even quite knew what a website was at that point. But in any case, now you know that you can't have a thing without visuals to go with it. We were very fortunate that when Ben and I published the idea for the observatory many, many years ago already, we were given permission by Nature magazine to use the illustration. We got the copyright for it, and it was an inspired illustration, and it has served as the inspiration for many of the visuals that you see on our website and elsewhere. And I'd also like to thank Hilton Simmett, especially among the STS fellows, for having taken that design and turned it into various other objects, such as the program and the posters that you see around. But speaking of vision and envisioning, you know, bad things happen, as we know, and it's easy right now to dwell on them, but remarkable things also happen. And I think if you're in universities, an institution that is strangely under attack these days in this country, those remarkable things take the central form of the engagement between instructor and student. And occasionally you meet a student and you wonder for the rest of your life if you ever taught anything to them. I know that as far as John McQuillan is concerned, he's taught me more than I think I ever conveyed to him, although at the time he told me that he found actor network theory to be persuasive when he sat in as a mid-career student in my seminar on science, power, and politics. But whatever the miraculous alchemy was, he then decided that STS was a thing that he was interested in supporting. And we have been extremely fortunate ever since in enjoying the loyalty and dedication of Elizabeth McQuillan and John McQuillan. And so I would like herewith to invite John to say a couple of words of welcome to all of you.
Good afternoon. On behalf of my wife, Elizabeth, and on behalf of Sheila Jasanoff, the McQuillan Institute's co-founder, director, and overall inspiration, I give thanks to everyone for convening today, and I thank all of our sponsors. With special thanks to the John Templeton Foundation, without whose support this program would not have been possible. As scientists and scholars of science and society, we share a deep understanding that technological power is never just about what we can do. It is always about what we choose to do and how those choices are framed, governed, and legitimized. That's what makes the work of this summit so vital. In the wake of advances in gene editing technologies, the boundary between somatic and germline intervention, therapy and enhancement, science and speculation is increasingly blurred. Genome editing has for some time been more than just a matter of laboratory possibility. It is a social and political proposition. It opens the human genome not only to correction, but to intervention with generational consequences. The Global Observatory doesn't presume to offer universal rules. Instead, it creates space for rigorous, inclusive deliberation. It recognizes that genome editing is not only a technical matter, but a cultural and ethical one, a terrain where governance must be informed by pluralism, not just consensus. It is precisely here that STS and scientific communities converge and should converge. The observatory asks us, as both investigators and interpreters of science, to reflect critically on the narratives we construct, the metaphors we use, and the futures we imagine. It invites us to resist the lure of inevitability and instead cultivate global anticipatory frameworks that are reflexive, participatory, and just. In an age of increasing techno-nationalism, the observatory reaffirms that genome editing is a global ethical project. Its work is an appeal to solidarity, not only across nations, but across disciplines, institutions, and epistemologies. I encourage everyone here to take this seriously, not just as an institutional initiative, but as a shared responsibility. Our roles as scientists, STS scholars, and practitioners are distinct, but our accountability is collective. The future of human genome editing depends on how well we attend together to the structures of governance, the contours of public reason, and the stories we tell about the possible. Thank you again, and please enjoy your time here.
So we're about to see some extraordinary choreography, although we didn't choreograph who was introducing it. So it's me. So we are going to start this afternoon with an artistic performance by Pigeonwing dance. It is called the Choreography of CRISPR. And to introduce it, I want to introduce Gabrielle Lamb, who is the artistic director of this New York-based dance company, Pigeonwing Dance. She's the choreographer of the piece that we'll see tonight. And after the piece, we will commence with our opening panel, which is entitled Twists and Turns in Decoding Life. So this will definitely get us in the mood. So let me welcome Gabrielle Lamb to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you also to Françoise Baylis for the introduction here. I'm Gabrielle Lamb. I'm a choreographer and performer based in New York City. Back during 2020, things got very slow in our field during the pandemic. And so I was looking around everywhere for different kinds of opportunities to keep my company working. And something that caught my eye was an open call from the MIT Museum. This was related to an exhibit to be called Gene Cultures, opening their new building here in Cambridge. And they were asking for artists to respond to themes having to do with gene editing and CRISPR specifically. And they also mentioned that you didn't need to be a scientist to apply. And I was grateful for that because I'm not, and I probably wouldn't have had the courage otherwise. So I did apply to make a dance film based on the action words related to CRISPR. And with my application, I submitted a short proof of concept, a video of a little solo I choreographed for myself and performed on the roof of my building in New York City. And I put animated super titles on it to indicate what word I was dancing at the moment. Happily, they accepted the proposal. And then I had quite a long time to read, think, watch and listen to everything I could find related to CRISPR. And that was about a year, actually. And after that, it was time to get into the studio with dancers and begin our research process together. And much like a scientific process, I think this involves coming into the space with a wisp of an idea that goes in unexpected directions once you start working. And so the first level is the level of raw movement without any idea of where it's going to go specifically. And I knew right at the outset I wanted to work with spirals, which are something that have always fascinated me and attracted me to the idea of interpreting DNA through dance. So we developed an arm improv that Victoria and Allegra are going to help me to demonstrate here. And so it has 3 constraints. The first one is that you hold this water bottle vertical. You spiral it in one continuous direction without reversing. And that you look like a dancer while you're doing it. And so within these simple constraints, there are a lot of possibilities, and everyone's body will respond differently. It's very rich. There's a lot, there's symmetry, there's asymmetry, speed, changes of level. There's a lot that can be done with it. Thank you, dancers. Good. So after that level of raw movement, after we've accumulated a lot of that, we go to move up to the compositional level. And there I bring 2 or more bodies together to work with some of these ideas and words. So in my reading process, I had collected a lot of words and phrases having to do with CRISPR. Most, but not all, were action verbs. And I'm going to read you a short list now and then do a little demo. So the short list is guide, cleave, insert, bind, replicate, replace, wrap, helix, unzip, zip, activate, and silence. So I'm going to invite Robin and Blue to come out here, and we're going to show you a very condensed little sequence to demonstrate how we can translate these words into movement. So we start with guide. The way that the guide RNA helps the CRISPR system to find its location. Next, we move to cleave. And then insert, bind, replicate. Replicate again. Replace. Wrap. Helix. Unzip. Zip. Unzip. Zip. And unzip. Activate. Silence. Thank you. Good. So as if you know about CRISPR, you'll probably have noticed this wasn't a linear step-by-step demonstration of what CRISPR is and what it does. I knew right at the beginning that I wasn't really going to make a scientific animation, a tool of scientific education. There are other people who are a lot more qualified than I am to do that. I knew it was my job to translate this into the language of dance in a way that made sense as dance. And my composer, James Budenich, was a great help in this. And every time I would start feeling like I need to be more literal, I would send him some music that had been composed as literally translating DNA into sound. And he would respond saying something like, yes, but it really doesn't sound very good. And I thought, yes, that's our job, right? As a choreographer and a composer, we're here to break this scientific drama apart into 1,000 pieces and put it back together in a way that makes sense in our own respective forms. So, however, having told you that we didn't work literally, I'm now going to show you the most literal part of the piece. This we call the snail. And here we translated an actual DNA sequence into movement using dancers as base pairs. So Victoria is going to offer G, her elbow, which can only be met by C, the hand. Then Allegra will offer A, her finger, to be met by T, the forehead. And then we continue along the strand a little ways, so on and so forth. Thank you, dancers. If we had a bigger budget, we would have more dancers and we wouldn't have to replace. like I said, this was a small portion of an actual sequence of DNA. And the one that I chose was the sequence that determines the direction that a snail shell spirals. And apparently this has been tinkered with using CRISPR. And finally, when we performed this at Asilomar, Françoise Baylis asked me a disarmingly simple question, which is what attracted you to this material beyond the fact that it was an opportunity? And I was surprised how hard it was for me to answer. So I want to answer now with the fact that it's about the story and about the narrative of it. A lot of times dance gets stuck telling stories of teenagers in love making bad decisions. And CRISPR is often represented by word processing metaphors. And I thought we both could have something to offer to the other. So I think of this as a drama, a dance drama taking place mostly at the molecular scale, starting with the strands of DNA spiraling, and only at the end, with the closing solo, zooming out to the human scale, where there are other kinds of dramas, cultural, ethical dramas that are going to be decided in places like this, at gatherings like this. Thank you so much and enjoy.
Thank you again to the Pigeonwing Dance Company for your choreography, and then we had a slightly more mundane choreography to set up these chairs. And with that, let's segue immediately into our first session, which we've called Twists and Turns and Decoding Life. And first, as a sort of overview, I can't imagine a more both diverse and experienced group of people to set us on this conversation. But what pleases me above all is that these are people that I've been in conversation with over years and years. And so they are every bit as much progenitors of the observatory project as we are. And I think that that kind of interweaving of strands of people with not the same interests, but in some sense intersecting and converging into the observatory program as a whole. But let me give a few brief words of introduction to each of them, because you can find much more detail on the website, and they're all very well known in and of themselves. But nevertheless, just so everybody knows the order of the speakers, we'll begin with Françoise Baylis. Apart from her professional role as philosopher in bioethics, she's a distinguished research professor emerita at Dalhousie University. She is one of the people who has been most intimately involved with the design of prior summits and has a historical overview of this entire process, almost nonpareil, I would say. And one of the things we haven't mentioned is that there's a special issue of comments and papers by many of the participants in today's event that's come out in CRISPR Journal. It's open access for the next couple of weeks, so you can get a look at those. And Françoise is one of the contributors to that. Next in line and in order is George Church, whose name is so synonymous with contemporary exciting developments in biotechnology that he genuinely does not need introduction in this audience, but he's professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School and of health sciences and technology at both Harvard and MIT. He leads the Wyss Institute Synthetic Biology program, focusing on genome engineering for regenerative medicine and bioproduction. And as I recall, George, you were present at that 2017 meeting, Editorial Aspirations, that set out some of the blueprint for where we are today. Next, after that, is Glenn Cohen, my esteemed colleague and professor of law at Harvard Law School and an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. He has been a prolific author and contributor to the development of bioethics across the entire range of health sciences and technologies, and again, a close friend of the program and of many of the participants in it. And then very much not least, but fourth in this gathering is Patricia Williams, University Distinguished Professor of Law and Humanities at Northeastern University and Director of that university's Law, Technology and Ethics Initiative. She is one of the world's best-known scholars of race, gender, and law, and is the author of numerous books, including The Alchemy of Race and Rights with Harvard University Press, which is a foundational text in critical race theory. Patricia Williams is a writer both for general audiences and for professional audiences, and I suspect that many of you have read her writings in places like the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian, and the Washington Post, among others. So with that, let me hand it over to Françoise, and people will speak relatively briefly. As moderator, I will see whether there are conversations to deepen further across the panel, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience.
Great. So I'd like to make a few kind of opening remarks and try to confine myself to my area of expertise, ethics, because I often want to wander into other areas. And when I look at sort of the twists and turns, one of the things that I find important is that I think increasingly there's a willingness to challenge what I would put under the banner of a trope about the fact that with respect to heritable human genome editing, we are responding to a compelling medical need. I think many of us have called that into question. In my own work, I've certainly tried to say, how do we understand the difference between a need and a want? And that makes a very important difference in terms of any kind of moral claim that we might make. I say that because I think we have different kinds of moral responsibilities to respond to needs than we might have to respond to wants. And I think what's really important from my point of view in seeing that is not only the increasing need for us to challenge that assumption, but the fact that I'm seeing it happen now from unexpected places. And I just want to quote one unexpected place. Many of you will perhaps remember the name Denis Rebikoff. Shortly after we heard of the experiment that He Jiankui had participated in 2018, Denis Rebikoff, a Russian scientist, said that yes, what he did was terrible, but what was terrible about that was the science, and I'm going to do it better. And doing it better for him meant also choosing a more important priority. So we weren't going to look at resistance to HIV, we were going to look at deafness, because that's a terrible thing and we need to fix it. And March of this year, 2025, Denis Rebikoff has changed his mind. And he has written, and I'm quoting, which is why I have a paper here, he actually said, deaf people don't want hearing children. You want to say, oh, okay, so he's finally understood something about the world. But he actually has understood something more because, and again, I am quoting from him, genome editing may only be considered when 4 alleles are compromised, leading to a serious monogenic disease as one that causes severe morbidity or premature death. Now, remember what he thinks he's talking about. That would include something that many others would contest. But he says, and I'm continuing, however, a married couple, and those are his words, other people do have reasons to have children, but anyhow, a married couple desperate for childbearing with severe morbidity or premature death in both partners is impossible to imagine. And so I think what's important about that quote is he's actually recognizing that this technology, if it were to be responding to the goal that's been articulated, which is there are people in the world who could not otherwise have healthy genetically related children, are in fact few and far between. They're not zero, but maybe we have to question that. I just want to end with one slide, which I'm going to ask them to put up now, and I'm sorry, the rest of the panelists will need to turn around to look at it, but I actually have it here, so I don't have to do that. These are actually statements over time, and this is where I think you can actually see some movement. So in 2015, this is a part of the statement that came out from the organizing committee, and it says, it would be irresponsible to proceed with any clinical use of germline editing unless and until, and you have 2 criteria set out. Safety and efficacy, broad societal consensus. I have much more I could say about both of those, but the point I want to make now is that's the position that was taken by the organizing committee, and full disclosure, I was a member of that organizing committee. A few years later, NASM issued a report, and they were not constrained by anything that was done at that meeting in 2015, but they say something that's really very, very different, not to say diametrically opposed. They say clinical trials using heritable germline genome editing should be permitted, provided the research is only for compelling reasons and under strict oversight. So you're seeing a definite shift in movement from it's irresponsible to it could happen if there's proper guardrails. In 2018, we have the 2nd International Summit in Hong Kong. And what's important for you to remember is that in 2015, when we have the first summit, it's because a scientist did work in non-viable embryos that were destroyed. In 2018, we have a scientist who does work in viable embryos, and we have a birth. And now we have an even different position being taken. We're not going back to what we said in 2015, that it would be irresponsible. We're actually saying it's time to have a rigorous, responsible pathway forward. And I think what I want you to take away is the juxtaposition of the science with this kind of policy statement. And I want to end, if you can just put up for me the 2023 statement, which was the 3rd International Summit. And what we have there is that heritable human genome remains unacceptable at this time. Preclinical evidence for, and I want you to see an attempt to map onto the language of 2015, say preclinical evidence for the safety and efficacy of heritable human genome editing has not been established, nor has societal discussion and policy debate been concluded. Full disclosure, I was a member of the planning committee for the third international summit, and I was not a member of the planning committee for the 2018 international summit. So to take away from that, it matters who's at the table. It's not just about the science or the ethics, it's about people, it's about power, it's about politics. So that's one of the things I want you to take away from my comments. The last thing I want to say then is when you look at this area and you look at ethics, I think we can take a short lesson, a small lesson from what we've seen with respect to somatic genome editing, where there is a lot more enthusiasm for the use of the technology in this context in order to further the development of therapeutic interventions for persons with conditions that are life-limiting, shall we say. In that context, we've raised questions recently in terms of issues to do with equity and access, because these therapeutic interventions are in the millions of dollars. We've also seen and have concerns raised about issues to do with exploitation in the offering up of clinical trials for things that might be described as spurious. And I want to end by mentioning those two things because though I think there's no reason to proceed with heritable human genome editing at this time, not because of the science, but because I haven't yet heard a good argument for it, and I'm suggesting the one we have heard about the compelling medical need doesn't apply. But that if we were, these two areas that are challenging from an ethics point of view would likely carry over to heritable human genome editing. So we would be worried about issues of access. And in my own work, I've said what we would have is a situation whereby people with privilege would take that privilege and entrench it in their DNA and pass it on for those generations. And then when we think about the medical tourism, we're already seeing that with respect to somatic genome editing in the area of life extension and increased muscle mass. What is it that we might see in the context of heritable human genome editing were this ever to pass? And I'm not the scientist, I get to pass it off to George now. I don't think it's going to happen in the ways that people imagine, but if it were, those would be the kinds of concerns I'd be raising. Thank you.
Well, I agree with essentially everything that's been said so far. I would say that the slides put a heavy emphasis on safety and efficacy, which is sort of the FDA version of ethics, but it shouldn't stop there. And I think we all recognize that it doesn't. Equitable access is a big aspect. And when they say safety and efficacy, they're not necessarily talking long-term. And when you talk about germline, you're talking about very long-term. If you want to get a cure for Alzheimer's through the germline, you got a 70-year clinical trial. And if you're worried about the children and grandchildren, it's already ridiculous at 70. So that's one kind of safety efficacy. It really doesn't consider long-term. And in terms of access, it's probably one of the worst accesses in history in that 8.1 billion of us are already missed our chance at germline editing. And so that means none of us have access to it. Now, the rich versus poor, I'm not sure I completely buy into that. And here I'll put on my technological hat. We saw that the cost can go as high as $4 million per dose for gene therapy. But it can go as low as $30 a dose if you consider the COVID vaccine a form of gene therapy, and it's formulated very similarly, single genes in either lipid nanoparticles or in viral capsids. So I think that we need to be clear that technology is improving exponentially, and people's use of it will not necessarily be determined by consensus. We already see we clearly don't have a consensus on gun use or abortion or a variety of other things. And there's some tolerance of that diversity. I agree that there's not a compelling medical argument yet, but there are lots of FDA-approved drugs that do not have a compelling medical need or even medical use, much less need. So these are just all of these things I'm saying are disturbing. Please don't misinterpret me as advocating anything here. Too often happens with scientists when they say what's possible. So the exponential change is something we need to take into account. The possibility that will be used off-label, or it will be used by the military, or it will be used by just people that have access to it. It isn't necessarily the rich, but it is in some sense going to be inequitably distributed, and we need to pay attention to that. And finally, I'd just like to say that the germline might be a bit of a distraction. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that the somatic gene therapy should be at least as much of a consideration here, because unlike germline, where you have to wait 70 years to see if it affects Alzheimer's, in principle, we get a gene therapy for Alzheimer's that takes effect within weeks or months. Clinical trials are getting shorter. We just saw Kieran's lovely thing that came out recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, or the 11-month clinical trial for the COVID vaccines. So time frame is getting shorter, and so all the things we dream of for germline in terms of enhancements, or are dismayed by in terms of enhancements, may be much easier to achieve in adults. Faster research cycles, and a much more willing and capable audience for that. People that would like to live longer, be healthier, enhanced in various ways. So I think we need to really pay attention to the somatic option for enhancement. Now, there are things that somatic can't do. It can't fix, say, someone who's, has a severe brain, microcephaly or something like that. But that's something that can be handled by, prenatal, preconception, various forms of alternatives to the therapy. But this enhancement, I think, is something that much more appropriately, or at least as appropriately, addressed in adults. Thank you.
Excellent. So I think when I look at the last 10 years, it's very important to recognize how central this group of people have been in the last 10 years of discussion about this. So I view this not as a culmination, but as a waypoint, but as a very successful waypoint your team has kind of put together, Sheila, here for this. When I think about the last 10 years kind of retrospectively, I think that the status quo has 2 pure blessings and 4 mixed blessings. So I'll start with the 2 pure blessings. The first pure blessing is that we haven't had another case of an unauthorized reproduction through this technology since the incident with Dr. He that's been reported. Maybe there are unreported cases that we don't know about, but I view that as a real successful mark. The second, and Francoise's work kind of mapping the international laws on the subject suggests, a lot of countries decided to put in place a law addressing this technology, typically a prohibitory stance, but a law in place where there otherwise might have been a vacuum. Not everyone, there are still gaps here. But I view that as another sort of success story for the engagement between the ethics, law, and science community. Okay, so those are the pure blessings. Now I'll tell you what I think the 4 mixed blessings are, and I find them more interesting myself. The first question is, it's quite hard to determine what innovations the existing status quo has ruled out, right? So imagine a counterfactual world where Dr. He didn't do the experiment, right? And then we had a different set of policies as to heritable genome editing. What has been left on the table? What's missing that would have actually had some benefit? And I think, and this has been alluded to, I think, by Francoise and others, it really is how you define benefit here is deeply connected to quite foundational philosophical questions. Among them are the question whether, in most of the applications, even the edge case applications that are few and far between for this technology, they typically can be solved by swapping in a different egg donor or a different sperm donor in place of the one you have in the rearing parents. So one fairly fundamental question is whether this is a technology aimed at ensuring a particular model of genetic parenthood mapping out with rearing parenthood. And if you say that actually that is not the kind of thing that this technology ought to be serving, whether you've now ruled out all or almost all of the cases, not even most or the vast majority of the cases. So I think that's a fundamental question. I think there are fundamental questions about intergenerational harm and how we think the act of creation and how we think what it means, what are our obligations to future generations to benefit, to harm, or none of the above to these entities. And so my own view is that even if you think you can identify candidate possible interventions, whether they are, the serious monogenic diseases, or Ravitsky, Bartholomopoulos, Erica Clutterman have a nice paper on this kind of criteria, you can't really answer the question about whether we've left something on the table we would like to have done without answering kind of these deeper philosophical questions. So it's turtles all the way down. Okay. Second mixed blessing, I think, has been a question about deliberative democracy and societal engagement. The 2015 summit suggested what would be required was, besides for safety and efficacy, quote, broad societal consensus about the appropriateness of the proposed application, unquote. I've always found that sentence quite interesting because it leaves a lot of open question. Who exactly is society? Why are you describing it singular rather than plural as multiple societies? What counts as consensus? We live in a country where we don't reach consensus on anything, right? Let alone something like this. Why is consensus the right litmus test for this technology compared to many of the other things we're trying to decide, like who should be on Medicaid, for example, right? And how are we going to measure it? But even if we think that the hurdle of consensus is too high, whatever hurdle you want to have in place, the truth of the matter is we haven't really done an amazing job having these serious engagements and conversation at the societal level on these topics. There are some positive stories here. This is why it's a mixed blessing. I would point to some of the work done on mitochondrial replacement techniques in the UK, in Australia, and Singapore, where there have been wide engagements. Some people would say that was not good enough, or the deck was stacked in the way it was done, but at least it was something. Here in this country, we've had bubkas, we've had nothing, right? And while there has been attempts to kind of do things like citizen jury by Australian academics on genome editing, for example, that I think of as a model, I think if we really do think that some kind of deep societal engagement here, some deliberative democracy experiment is a necessary precondition for doing this work well and for getting there, we really haven't put the effort in. Okay, third mixed blessing, a lack of nuance in the lawmaking we have had. So in the United States, for example, for many years now, we've had an appropriations a rider called the Aderholt Amendment after Senator Aderholt was put in place. It says none of the funds made available by this act may be used to notify a sponsor or otherwise acknowledge receipt of a submission for an exemption for investigational use of a drug, biologic, ... in research in which a human embryo is intentionally created or modified to include a heritable genetic modification. Any such submission shall be deemed to have not been received by the secretary, and the exemption may not go into effect. So this language has effectively prevented FDA from considering any possible new drug application, biologic application, however you want to describe it, involving heritable genome modification. And if you went ahead and did it without this consideration, you'd be in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. You might face civil or criminal penalties. The problem is this language is pretty general and pretty vague, and it's swept into a bunch of other things that you might think are quite different from this. Mitochondrial replacement techniques, in vitro gametogenesis, creating synthetic gametes, a bunch of other kinds of technologies. And because we are in a position of stop in terms of genome editing, it's radiated outward in a way that you might think, or you might not think, that these other technologies are very different. You might think it's all the same thing, or you might think they're very different. And yet we never get there because we have an appropriations rider that's very sticky and stuck us in a particular place where all of this is being blocked. Okay, lastly, the last mixed blessing is if you are the kind of person that think that there ought to be a translational pathway, or one could imagine a translational pathway towards heritable genome editing. Maybe we haven't found the use case yet, but it's possible. You kind of would like to road test a bunch of different regulatory regimes, right? We got one that was proposed in the 2020 consensus study report of the National Academy of Science and Medicine and the UK Royal Society. I think it does a pretty good job of setting out what this would look like. But because we don't have any policy variation for the most part across the world, we really don't have any opportunity to stand back and evaluate what a good regulatory design would look like. And that's a problem from my perspective.
So my concern about this is sort of backing up and looking to see whether we have even the language to talk about the to lay the groundwork for the kind of engagement that was just referred to. And that's it's my concern is the paradox that we present ourselves that evades any kind of effective governance that makes sense. And so I think back in 2000, the year 2000, when President Bill Clinton held a press conference to announce the successes of the Human Genome Project, and he celebrated it in these words. He said it was miraculous because we are learning the language in which God created the universe. We are gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. Now, at the same time, in the same speech, Clinton went on to introduce a paradox that was quite in contrast with this sort of all-encompassing language of miracle and godlike gift. He said, I want to emphasize that biotechnology companies are absolutely essential in this endeavor, for it is they who will bring to the market the life-enhancing applications of the information from the human genome. And for that reason, this administration is committed to helping them make the kind of long-term investments that will change the face of medicine forever. And so he shifted from a kind of theocratic language to the language of contractarian investment bottom line balance sheets. And so this paradox posited to the White House in 2000 recognized even back then a significant conceptual conundrum in assigning a category of the sacred to codes of life that was simultaneously about to be exploited as mere inanimate products. And this tension between contractarianism and something larger, at least like constitutionalism or human rights or dignity, is one we confront every time we attempt to squeeze complex living beings or animated, vivified, communally generative entities into the jurisprudential frame of contract. I mean, you can just consider the quasi-theological debates around the contract status of IVF or surrogacy or embryo selection that one recently saw in the Supreme Court of Alabama. It arises whenever we reduce the complexities of constitutional or larger dignitarian problems into the narrower, de-animating, fungible, efficiently disconnected moral and jurisprudential frame of privatized cost-benefit analysis. My first connection to what is now known as the Human Genome Project was sometime around 2012 when Professor Jasanoff hosted a conference here whose keynote speaker was Anne Wojcicki, the head founder of 23andMe. And in those days, the conversation was still presented as a somewhat upbeat vision and vista of hope and possibility. And the discourse was underwritten by an optimistic mood. People were celebrating the genome's potential to find and create new continuities of discovery and universalism. There was still an inclusive sense that we are the same. Direct-to-consumer companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, et cetera, were still new and still selling their insight as instruments of communion and personal discovery. We, the people, were finally to be recognized as one species, thereby strengthening our human connection to one another. And these companies, I think, just seduced us, advertising their products as a means to reach back through time to find lost family across diaspora, genocide, and deeply buried family secrets. And that's fine, but what they did not foreground were the contractual terms of service that have always treated donors' genetic material as corporate assets. And that reality is surely haunting those who have used 23andMe, which has recently filed for bankruptcy. While promising privacy on the one hand, in other words, privacy as an aspect of the dignitarian, such terms will be suspended in the name of economic necessity, and the entire trove of millions of bits of DNA data can be transferred to the highest bidder without consent from any member of the database. Moreover, since 2000, the conversation about genomic discovery
has shifted well away from mere inclusive family connection. By 2008, scientists, public ethicists were sounding the alarm about a retreat from genomic citizenship being celebrated as human sameness. Rather, there was already a visible dark return toward the disconnections of difference. And this new search for difference was not just about prioritization of research about medical abnormalities as part of a healing general public health endeavor. And it's progressed so that by now, in 2025, it has become more overtly racialized, more stylized as a means of predictive, future-oriented control of genetic outcomes. And over the last 2 decades, in other words, the search for, quote, distinct genetic markers that might be mined for profit has been transformed into a new configuration of a very old genetic project, I fear, of finding destiny in the body. Individual actors and venture capitalists have founded private companies that sell golden passports to engineered futures, hybrid creatures for some wonderful things like organ transplantation, but also fantasies of bringing back to life that which has become dust. Designer pets, embryo selection that purportedly ensures genetic pathways to imagined purity, outright eugenic manipulation that promises not just better children, but better than children. Editing disease traits out was one definition of human healing, but now there's a lucrative market for editing out based on superficial cosmetic potential and adding in trendy designer features, arranged in hierarchically scaled pricing systems according to private markets for perfection and acceptance to Ivy League or Oxbridge, and marketed as an end to loneliness. Your children will be accepted. And it doesn't matter what's happening in the labs. It seems to me that all of this technology is racing ahead apace, regardless of the governance systems we attempt to put in place. People play their longings forward by investing fortunes in the faith that beauty, athleticism, and intelligence and other cultural norms can be purchased at the gametic level, written into the human germline or somatically. Their value as a trend mistaken for evolutionary resilience. Aristotle wrote that a slave is a live article of property, and I certainly don't mean to be hyperbolic by this comparison to slavery, but the age of the slave trade and then the Industrial Revolution gave us a stock market of property that I think still inhabits our notion of trade and what can be marketed. This necessitated eugenic rationalizations for systems of ownership that granted control of life-sustaining property interests to some, but not all, human beings. It necessitated disinviting some from the classification of human being, or the marking of some as subhuman, subspecies, second-class citizen, distinctions among communities of regard and disregard, useful and useless, deserving and undeserving, those fit to be seen, distinguished from the unsightly. And as we have slid into an era of hyper-econometric discourse, where the very existence of public and civil governance is imperiled, being undone, and where economic transactionalism dominates most all relationships, not just this sphere, the value of the body, the value of the human, the person, the citizen, has become less and less located as priceless or inalienable or sacred in that God-given sense Clinton talked about in 2000. Every bit of ourselves is ranked, graded, priced, classed, marked as worth it or not. And again, I view this as a pre-existing discourse clash, a conundrum between private property law and public civil rights law. It's a clash of governance systems. And as we lose more and more of public law systems of accountability based on transparency, precisely the deliberative justice to which we all appealed, the oversight, checks and balances, limits on the use of force and infliction of pain, and now the possibility of losing habeas corpus, we find more and more of ourselves tethered instead to the bottom line of a balance sheet.
So thank you all for these extremely interesting opening interventions. I could just ask you if you want to respond to each other, but let me say a couple of words about things I heard that you might want to pick up on. So Glenn, beginning with your, as usual, extremely clearly laid out distinction between the pure blessing and the mixed blessing. Of course, I'm tempted to ask whether the pure exists on the non-blessing side as well. And to some extent, one can hear the implicit dialogue between you and Patricia as exploring that territory. So if there are initial settings, whether in language between contract and constitution, or one is a little cautious about using the title original sin right now this week, but in any case, if there are societal original sins that are somehow back of the ways in which we construe or deploy or use our imaginations of what technology is possible, can there be such a thing as a pure blessing? And, you know, were you, in a sense, telling a ameliorative story of, oh, well, we don't get everything right all the time, but over time things do get kind of better. And besides, we haven't done the unthinkables yet. So that's a good thing. But it seems to me that there's a contrast between your position and Pat's position along those lines, along the sort of initial setting of the discourse and the societal conditions underpinning that discourse as well. And then maybe a slightly similar sort of tension between Francoise and George as well. I mean, George, you began by saying that there was nothing Francoise said that you disagreed with. Then you gave us an implicit critique of FDA by saying this was FDA ethics. So I would love to have you say a bit more about what you think ethics would be if it were not FDA ethics, but cut loose from the safety and efficacy, and how you might, for instance, respond to Francoise's kind of challenge. Patricia's kind of challenge. And then, Francoise, you put the politics question as frontally on the table as Patricia, but from a different angle. I mean, so you called attention to who is setting the what George Daly, for instance, has called the traffic light model for how we should go forward with technological developments, in particular in the area of genome editing. So George loves to talk about red, yellow, and green, and that there are some red light technologies and some yellow and some green. And I think you described the progression from the first to the third summit as the first summit having been conscious of there being a possibility of some red lights, but then the red lights kind of disappearing into a much more come hither yellowish tinge, and just get the regulation right. And then by now we have, as long as you take care of equitable access, anything is fine. So a progression from red to green without including even all the voices that people thought relevant. So you were there at stage 1 and stage 3, but not at stage 2. So I wonder again how you and George might talk about this question of limits and where they come from, and if there is FDA ethics, is there an implicit slide into the easiness of the safety efficacy discourse, and people don't. It's not innocent that people talk about that. It's already given. That's the yellow light zone. And, Massachusetts drivers construe red lights as yellow, at least for a few seconds after the lights have turned. So I think there is this question of where we stand in relation to this, who gets the nod and to what. So I don't know, Francoise, do you want to say a bit more to start with?
Sure. I'll say a couple of things. I think that one of the things that I have said before, and I'll repeat for those who haven't heard it before, when I talk about what happened in 2015 and this ethics framework, I present it as a very powerful framework because of its simplicity. and its complexity. And the simplicity comes from an ethics framework with only two elements. And anybody who works in ethics knows there's not a lot of ethics frameworks with two elements, right? And that's all there is: safety and efficacy and broad societal consensus. And yet it's complex, and the complexity comes from the fact that nobody knows what either of those two things mean. And you don't even know what safety and efficacy means. Why? Because nothing is ever 100% safe and effective, whatever you think it means. And so somebody somewhere, or some group of people somewhere, has to make a decision about that. And so I've tried to unpack both of those things in different kinds of ways. And I've also then tried to make the point that safety and efficacy is in fact not just about science. It's value laden, it's extremely value laden, and we need to appreciate that. I think for me, one of the things that's been interesting since then, working in this area, but a number of other areas of science, most of the life sciences, how repeatedly scientists have asked questions like, are there no red lines? And it's been striking to me how few scientists are willing to say, no, there is a red line and this one we're not crossing. I think we're seeing that now with respect to mirror life, that people are willing to sort of start talking about a red line, but I find that quite fascinating. And it seems to me that at least in the circles that I've moved in, it seems to be repeating things that David Baltimore has said repeatedly with respect to the notion or concept of a moratorium. We don't want a moratorium because people will understand that as a permanent ban, and we can't possibly know and or appreciate what might all be the potential benefits of science. And so we ought not to be setting up these red lines and stopping ourselves from doing things, and giving the message to the general public that, you know, that's the way of being responsible, because that's not necessarily the way of being responsible, having these red lines. I just want to say one last thing that I think is really important when we allude to sort of the traffic lights. I think we need to remember that in some parts of the world, it doesn't just go from green to yellow to red, it also goes from red to yellow to green. And so I think it's really behooves us to think about what are the cultural ways in which we think about what green means and what red means, what yellow means. And in some places, yellow just means go faster so you get there before the red line. And in some cases, it means, you know, slow down because we're heading towards a red line or we're going to the direction of green. So a little bit of rambling, but a number of different kinds of responses. George, say that you agree with me again. I like that.
Hopefully, yes. Yeah. I think Sheila asked me, and it's relevant to what Francois said, is I wasn't advocating the FDA should have less safety and efficacy. Maybe that's not what you said. I was advocating it should have more. In particular, it should have more in the category of long-term effects. Because very often, the clinical trial is over in 5 to 10 years, and then we move into phase 4 clinical trials, which is everybody in the world is exposed to it. And even that, it can take many decades or even generations to see what the problems are with Vioxx or with thalidomide, or you have it. In addition, I don't think this will be in their purview, but to really take the FDA purview out to other ethical things, which are quite evident, is the equitable distribution. If you haven't planned on having it, I think the FDA is perfectly okay with approving multi-million-dollar drugs. They've been doing that, but it's a nice technological goal to make it equitable from the very beginning, and there has to be incentives for that. Which brings me to the last point, which is about moratoria. I agree with what David says, but I would add to it is that the moratoria are often framed as something that's redundant. That is to say, we already have laws that prevent people from using drugs in a non-FDA approved manner, of advertising them in that manner. And so the moratorium is some kind of posturing, potentially. I'm not saying it is, but it could be, where we're saying, we have 2 laws now, and that makes it so much. But what we really need is, and we have like voluntary, everybody signed for this moratorium and all of the responsible science sign it. Well, what about the irresponsible science? What we need in every case that we would consider moratorium on top of something that's already there, maybe we should consider surveillance and consequences. If people know that there's a lot of surveillance, a lot of people knew what He Jiankui had going. I mean, both in the United States and China, but they didn't know who to report it to, or even that they should report it. So you need whistleblowers, you need to incentivize them, you need to really severely disincentivize whatever you don't want to happen. And that means maybe it should have been an international announcement that you're going to spend 3 years in jail, or maybe it should have been longer time in jail. If you really want to disincentivize things, you can't just say, just be good, sign this thing and everything's going to be fine. So those are my comments. Yeah.
I guess I'll jump in. So it was funny we're talking so much about moratorium. I distinctly remember after that paper came out, sitting, I believe it was over at the Kennedy School, we had this conversation about why a moratorium, what's the difference between a moratorium versus prohibition by law. And one of the things I remember discussing back then with many of these same people in this room is a moratorium makes perfect sense to put pause if you think there's something you're going to learn that's going to cause you to either unpause or hit stop. But if you have all of the answers to what you need to make the decision now, because it's not about the safety and the efficacy of the thing, it's about an in principle objection to the process, right? A moratorium is a little bit strange as a way of approaching it. So now, this many years on, I guess I still remain puzzled about what kinds of questions we'd want the answers to other than safety and efficacy. And I guess I'll also say that I think for me, I'm ambivalent about this, but I think there's two ways of thinking about this technology. One is what I'll call more than two ways, but two ways I'll propose. One is calling it the exceptionalizing view, which is to say heritable genome editing is this special thing that requires special reactions, and both morally, legally, and the like, it's over here. The other is to view it as part of a continuity of technologies that are related in some ways from others, including somatic gene therapy, in vitro gametogenesis, mitochondrial techniques, but also, by the way, in vitro fertilization, because we could have many of the same conversations about what we knew we didn't know when IVF entered practice and the question about long-term safety studies and the like. And the more one begins to see it as continuous with these other kinds of technologies, the more questions one has about whether the approach we've taken ought also to be continuous in some way or another, or whether there's something especially bad about this or especially problematic about this. And, I think that it's interesting that we've ended up in a position where we've been very exceptional about the prohibitory nature of our approach to this in many places across the world. And some people would say we should also have been prohibitory or more prohibitory as to many of those other technologies. And others would say, actually, some of those other technologies are success stories that we're kind of happy the way history unfolded. And maybe this could be one of them too.
I mean, I suppose I could. I think that, again, it highlights a kind of paradox between a geography that is run by legislative rules at with a concern about public health as its driving ethic, as opposed to an approach to this technology as producing products. And product liability is and even I'm not imposing the whole doctrine of product liability on this, but as a product, it is very different remedially from the way in which we treat human services or interactions. And if it's in the discourse of contract, whether it's actually blatantly out there in terms of cash on the barrelhead transaction, that discourse is one of hurry up immediacy. It's precisely the jumping the red light because you want to get there before anybody else does. And the role of investment, of return, hastens, it's speed in politics, as the philosopher Paul describes it. And the sense of risk is encouraged, taking risks is encouraged, and the way in which you get people and developers and technologists to take risks is to limit the liability. And it seems to me that that is not really brought into this conversation about what's happening in labs. And when it does, it tends to be evaded by, again, what I think of as tricks of discourse. So I think the last time I was here, we were talking about whether or not genes should, for example, have a First Amendment right to self-expression. I mean, that literally genes would express, but then be protected by the First Amendment. And this, it seems to me, was a way of manipulating a particular outcome for purposes of the ability to exploit by shifting it from one domain of law to another, which was more protective for a particular outcome. But all of that is a contractarian, a hyper-econometric kind of lens with which to see the regulation even before we talk about what we see it. We see a gene, for example, as having agency for some purposes, but not for others. And it seems to me that was what was so tricky and slippery about the way in which we view the frozen embryos, which fell on the floor and were non-viable, but the question is whether or not that's an issue of life or death. And the punishments that we exacted for that came from, again, almost theological fantasies, but also, and they came up against a wall when a large outcry of women protested, not just in terms of their ability to do with their bodies as they like. It was the industry. It was the fertilization industry, the fertility industry that stepped in. And it seems to me that, again, all of those kinds of forces are things we don't deal with as discourses that direct our vision, that predict or haunt and dictate the outcome without our necessarily ascribing to that particular outcome before it actually happens. And the other thing is that contractarianism, which I think floods everything we see today, is a mood, literally like language mood, like the subjunctive. And so contract in particular creates an as if mood. It's an expectation interest buried in that particular body of law. And so we treat, I think, the as if as is. So it's like a collapse of the subjunctive in the way in which we refer to possibilities as present. And therefore we can, it eliminates the caution of an is or an ought. The subjunctive is where the ought lives, right? Or the, should. But when you collapse the subjunctive into the present possibility, of course, go ahead, which is what the body of contract does. It eliminates that sense of hesitation. It eliminates all of the, as simply inefficient or as transaction costs, which shouldn't be part of the equation. And that's what, we don't talk about that, but it seems to me that is directing a lot of what this industry is about. I don't know if you agree, but.
Well, you'll have a chance to come back and respond, but let's open it up to the audience now. I think there are people with microphones, and so if you raise your hand, then someone will come with a microphone near you. Please introduce yourself very quickly, and the Kennedy School injunction, ideally end your question with a question mark. And if there's a particular person you're directing your question to, please say who. So right here in the middle.
My name is Toby Warden. I'm a social scientist working on genetic biocontrol. And my question begins with George, but it goes to the whole panel. George, you said that, if I have this right, you said that use cannot be determined by consensus. So then what is the role, what might or should be the role of the public in decision-making? And then going back to what Glenn had acknowledged, that this idea of societal discussion or consensus, we don't even know what that means yet.
Yeah, well, I think that on rare occasions, there is societal consensus, and that obviously should be easy to respect. But I think in most cases, the broad discussion helps bring us to a majority rule, which means that 49% might be very upset. And it could go either way on this issue. So I think that's all I was saying, really. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that I think consensus-based rules put a lot of emphasis on the default setting and give the default setting a lot of moral authority and a lot of moral force. And there's a way with technological development that that does put things in one direction. Now, you might say, well, yes, but actually the forces of contract, the forces of commercialization, econometrics have a lot of momentum and force in the other direction. So maybe we've reached a sort of détente that works okay in the vast majority of cases. But I do think there's this interesting question about status quo bias and why thinking that we need consensus to shift off the status quo rather than shifting towards the status quo is an interesting decision problem. And whether that makes you question about consensus is a good metric for moving forward on things.
If I can just add to that, I think one of the things that's important is that we don't actually necessarily all agree or use the word consensus in the same way. And certainly in my work, I ended up focusing on that after the 2015 statement and spent a lot of time saying that consensus is not first and foremost about unanimity. It's about unity. And then I try to remind people about all of the realms in which they do consensus building all the time. I mean, if you don't want to be in a fractured family, you find ways of compromising and reaching consensus around things. You do that in your book club. You might do that in your religious community. We do that in all kinds of ways. I think what's interesting and challenging in this kind of space is to actually put the word societal in front of it, right? And I will say to you up front, I don't know how to upscale it to societal. So I'm acknowledging that that's really a different and difficult kind of thing to think about. But I just think it's a project worth undertaking because it's relevant not just to genome editing, it's relevant to how we respond to climate change, it's relevant to how we respond to nuclear war possibilities. There's so many realms, and what we need to do is to better understand the human brain and how we work. And we don't invest half as much money in understanding how it is that humans hold on to contradictions, how it is that humans are not just rational beings, and so we can't just analyze our decision-making through rational frameworks. And so I think that's at least what I'm working towards when I talk about consensus. And very often I'm actually talking about consensus building with the idea that we may never get there, but boy, it's worth the candle, right? It's worth trying because you do different things if that's what you're trying to work towards. And we're all better off for having tried, even if we fail.
John Evans.
Thank you. I have a question for Glenn. So I agree with your description of moratoriums and bans. Moratorium, gather more information before you decide what to do. Ban means we know right now, so there's no more information needed. Other people have challenged that, which is to say, a ban, should we revisit the notion of a ban every generation? Because the ban is based upon our current values, et cetera. So is a ban our gift to future generations, or is a ban something that has to be revisited every generation?
Great question. And I'll just say that I think, and we haven't really talked about this, the relationship of this debate to debates about intergenerational justice and attitudes towards intergenerational relations more generally is very interesting. In that kind of assumes there's a fixed generation in the future that's going to come into existence, as opposed to here in climate change, where some of the decisions we make are going to determine not only who comes into existence, but how many people comes into existence, the nature of a society, right? So there's a way in which you might think, just to take like, I don't know, it's not here, but a Julian Savulescu idea, like let's engage in all this moral enhancement to make actually our offspring so much more moral and wonderfully moral than we are, right? That actually gifting that to them would be, you might think it's a very good reason why they should have the opportunity to revisit it, because gosh darn it, they're much more moral, much more enlightened. There's the better angels of our generation, right? So I think there's this very interesting question about how to think about something. Now, in reality, I will tell you, when you introduce something to law and a prohibition in law on a practice, it is fairly sticky, right? I think about like the Dickey-Wicker Amendment relating to, even when we have democratic administrations, we don't get rid of that thing. It's not like the Mexico City gag clause that goes back and forth in terms of funding this. So there's a way in which lawmaking in this space tends to be relatively sticky, such that even if your ambition is to have an ability to revise and revisit, the reality of just political settings. And I'm not enough of a comparativist to be able to tell you whether this is distinctly or not uniquely a facet of American legalism that's quite different from elsewhere, that we see much more of these revolutions. But when it comes to the space, for better or worse, what we set the setting out at the beginning often carries on for a long time.
Yep.
Hi, Adam Zaretsky. I'm a bioartist, and I've been sort of into this for 25 years too. And germline editing for me is an art form. It's a kind of sculpting, maybe zygote flesh sculpting. If you're bringing in edits of alternative traits and different morphologies and different developmental or even interspecies constructs, and they're considered to just be creativity in the human germline commons, then how are all these clinical trials designed by untrained artists? In other words, if you're sculpting, if you're dwelling on the plasticity of the human species, shouldn't you at least be required to have some coursework in sculpting itself? Otherwise, it's just naive or somewhat brute art.
Directed to anybody in particular, Adam?
Well, I don't know. George is most involved, but I think I'm loving everybody. You're all wonderful voices. So anyone who wants to grab it.
I'll take it. So I have an artist in my laboratory named Joe Davis, who's quite well known, and I guess my return question is a degree in art required for art right now? I mean, or even a course? I don't think so. But I don't think it's an appropriate metaphor for this. I mean, I think this is considerably more serious consequences than most art. I don't mean to insult art. I mean to just say that this is very serious. It's more like maybe like architecture where buildings fall down and people die, which is a form of art.
Over here.
My name is Gary Noreen. I'm a retired JPL Caltech systems architect with no background in genetics. I have a question for George. I've heard this from geneticists, from people in genetics before, that my niece, for example, has a PhD in genetics, and she tells me it'll be 300 years before we'd be able to do heritable genome editing on humans because we have to wait so long. I'm wondering if, in fact, there might be other ways of going about doing it that would take a lot less time. I don't think we necessarily need to do FDA trials the way we've always done them. They were suspended, for example, in some respects for Operation Warp Speed, which resulted in the coronaviruses coming out in record time. And I think that, for example, let me give something on the top of the mind. Once again, I'm not a clinical person, but I'm wondering if edits are made that result in something that could have occurred otherwise through meiosis or natural processes, but you make an edit so that it actually would be exactly the same as it normally would have been, except a positive allele rather than one that would cause problems. Wouldn't you be able to potentially authorize that if you get it through the embryo stage? And then a further question for the panel as a whole. I'm wondering why we're forbidding embryo experiments, and then saying, well, we can't do clinical trials until we've demonstrated that it works. Well, how can you do that without extending the moratoriums on, or stopping some of the moratoriums on embryos? So anyway.
So I think the 300 years it's only if society wants an abundance of caution, if they are concerned that this particular therapy or preventative could have multi-generational effects. In principle, getting cancer chemotherapy could cause mutations in the germline that could have multi-generational effects, but because it's random, we figure it's like everything else in our life. So I think the 300 years is something that will depend tremendously on conversations like this one here, because there are many things that we approve for drug use because they're not because there's no risk, but because the benefits outweigh the risks, and we're willing to calculate the risks, estimate them. So I think it could be 300 years, it could be 10 years, just like many other clinical trials. You know, why we worry about it is that, yes, you can take an allele that already exists in the population, it's been well tested. This argument is actually used for developing drugs as well, but specifically, if you edit that allele in a baby, it should have predictable results, but there's issues about off-target effects, depending on how you do the editing. There's issues about epigenetic effects where, yes, you just change the DNA, but in the process, you introduce a force that somehow affects the rest. Some of these are hypothetical, but they're not hypothetical enough that we would just go blithely into a 11-month clinical trial like we did for COVID. And to Francois's comment that there's not a strong medical need to have an enhancement like a CCR5 or a PCSK9 or something like that. I'll let the panel answer your other question.
Is anyone else want to say something? Maybe I'll just say that I think that there's preclinical work, there's animal work, right? That you can get some of the way there, but it is absolutely true that unless you start doing it in human beings, there's data you're missing to be able to pronounce it. Fine, this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, so I don't think you're wrong to identify it as such, and my colleagues may disagree with me. But that has been true with a lot of technologies, including in vitro fertilization, right? We did a ton of work before it was introduced in human beings. We should have collected a lot more data since then. We've had a lot of anecdotal data, but no systematic data collection the way we probably ought to have done it. But there was a moment when we made a decision to do it. And I think part of this is to say, I think if I can underline something Georgia said, is that typically it's not a question of no risk. It's a question of what an acceptable level of risk is. But that can only be answered in relation to a benefit side of the equation and how compelling you think the medical need involved is too.
Kaushik Sundararajan, I'm an anthropologist at the University of Chicago. So I think there was an implicit assumption in the academy's discourse in the trajectory from 2015 to 2023 that Francois put up, which is that technology changes more rapidly than social norms, right? And that social norms operate broadly within a post-World War II liberal consensus that an explicitly eugenic public reason is unacceptable. Right? So there might be bitter debates within that broad normative framework, but there was still there seemed to be an implicit assuredness that while science might open up eugenic potentiality, society, at least Western liberal democratic society, will set some kind of normative limits, right? I don't think that's any longer the case. And I think that something really shifted, especially during COVID and especially in this country, where a certain expression of that liberal consensus was mask and vaccinate in order to protect the most vulnerable in our society. And what one saw was the emergence of a counter discourse that said that those who are so vulnerable that they impinge on our freedoms deserve to die. And that counter discourse wasn't just emerging out of the far right, and it's not just emerging in this country, right? So Pat, I agree that we don't have a language for governance, but I think we also don't have an imagination for governance when social norms collapse or change as rapidly or as spectacularly as technology apparently changes, right? Such that what was not that long ago considered unsayable in public, whatever one might think in private, is now not just sayable, but is desirable, and arguably in this country now has the backing of state power, right? So how do we build capacity for an imagination of social and normative change that is adequate to these times when the kind of implicit sociological assumption underlying governance conversations are arguably no longer valid or are becoming less valid very rapidly?
I don't have an answer to that, but you're right. That's just beneath what I'm most concerned about. It's watching this pronatalist.com. It's watching Elon Musk. It's watching, people who have decided they're going to privately use CRISPR for the improvement of, whatever. And it's watching my own students. I used to co-teach a class with a biologist when I was at Columbia. And, our ways of approaching things were very different. But one thing we would begin with every semester is having literally everybody take a piece of paper and a pencil and draw what they thought their genome looked like, or just draw. Nobody ever drew in their projected art. They never drew the double helix. They never drew anything that was actually related to this biology. They drew all these projected fantasies. And it was all about their individual control of it. That was what they wanted to get out of this class. They would make pictures of, the Harvard beanie. They would make pictures of, their children's T-shirts with the success and so forth. But there was this, and this was a class mostly of people who were studying genetics, who were biologists, who were going on to, but what this foregrounded was the directive fantasies that we all have in our heads about what that means. But the enactment of that is something that certainly has, come out in this moment where we've destroyed every bit of public architecture for governing and relied upon a kind of private, self-directed multiplicity of directions that knows no break. And that, so I don't have an answer to that, but that's why I'm the little, the voice of doom on every one of these panels that you put me on since 2012.
Maybe I'll just say something that I think that this current moment is super interesting in the following sense. When I imagine, you remember that old skit of Barack Obama's anger interpreter who's saying all the things Barack Obama. So I imagine the equivalent at the typical White House cabinet meeting, right? And they ask them, what was the problem with COVID? Here are 4 very different positions. One is they didn't let us have the thing we wanted, ivermectin, because they said, you can't have it, we're in charge. Second problem, those vaccine trials were not well controlled enough, not long enough. They really needed more rigorous study and placebo. So we need more FDA. Third problem, people stopped having babies. We need to invest and spend money to make sure America is pregnant again, make America pregnant again, right? Fourth problem is that the problem with this technology is destroying embryos and not treating life as reverent, and that's why this technology is problematic. Those are 4 very different attitudes as to what you should do about heritable gene editing. And I'm not sure what's in ascendant, and I'm not sure they're even talking to one another. And I find that very puzzling and interesting, even though I don't know how it's going to come out.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Blugmeyer Burke. I am here from Gallaudet University, and I'm a professor of philosophy. And I really appreciate the comments about Dennis Riberkov and the changing roles that exist. We start with teaching deaf communities, and then we go to making decisions on those issues. And the environmental issues that are related to deafness and how we have these discussions when we're making decisions for them versus when we're bringing them into the conversation. We have such a huge variety of deaf people, whether they're going to be oral presenting and preferring that, or they're going to use sign language. And then it's almost impossible then to get a consensus of deaf people. So when we talk about the deafness, we have a hard time even making a decision just as for deaf people, because they all have different ideas, they all have different project goals in mind. So reaching that consensus is very difficult even among the deaf community. let alone trying to make decisions, making what they want and what they don't want. So when we're looking at that in a micro level, it becomes confusing. But then when we're going to a macro level, we have to really think about who has more weight. So for example, for some deaf people who sign, they feel like there is a risk or a danger of, an existential threat, that hearing people have a different point of view. And so therefore they want to weigh out whether they're going to have a dialogue with the hearing people and have a consensus with what hearing people want them to have. And so I'm interested in what your thoughts are on getting the community's opinions on those things.
I think one of the, first things that you've said, which I think is critically important, is that we shouldn't be making assumptions that everybody agrees within any kind of community, whether it's deafness or whether we're talking about people with asthma. I mean, it really doesn't matter. We don't essentialize a community based on a particular trait. I think the other thing that's really important that the deaf community has insisted upon is that we are a community, and communities have divergences within the community. And I think also part of your claim is, who gets to be at the table and which table and what conversations and what accommodations are made and what assumptions are made. I do want to say, for those of you who, maybe weren't at the 2015 meeting or aware of that, this was an issue the day we opened. And it's the first conference I attended personally, where I was actually following the conference online and in person. And I saw on my phone that there was this whole discourse happening amongst people who were saying, we can't participate, what's going on? And there's nothing for, the deaf community. And I literally got up out of my chair and I ran to Anne-Marie Maz and said, we've made a huge mistake, we have to fix this. And they did. It took them a while, but they did. And I thought that that was actually a really important thing on both fronts, that a claim was made that we get to participate in this conversation, and there was a response. And I think we're at a different time today that didn't even have to be asked for, and it's here. So I think that there are many ways in which that participation has been important in terms of reminding people about the breadth of diversity and the ways in which people want to contribute and want to be part of conversation. So for me, that's part of what consensus building is about. It's about not assuming that it's those who show up at the table, but it's about understanding. I'll go back to a comment that's indirectly tied to your conversation. That bioethics should also be about architecture, and the architecture here is making welcoming spaces. And a welcoming space, it's not enough to say, well, the door's open, you could have walked through. It's like, yeah, but it didn't look like it was going to be a whole lot of fun for me on the other side once I stepped over the sill. And so I think that that's a really important thing, that when you're clamoring for participation versus you're invited in a way that there's an effort to make it welcoming. So thank you for coming, Teresa.
I'm going to take a few hands here, but maybe Christiana to start with.
Thank you. My name is Christiane Wopen. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Life Ethics at the University of Bonn in Germany. And my question refers to the title of this panel. So it's Twists and Turns in Decoding Life. And I would be very much interested in what all of you think when you say I decode life, or what should be done when decoding life. I have in mind, for example, the extended evolutionary synthesis, which I find much more convincing than other approaches to explaining the role of the genome for the human being or for other forms of life. And so it's scientifically even contested how life came into this world at all from 4 billion years ago. So when decoding life, what does that mean? So why is it so evident, it seems so evident, that it is a biological issue? Why isn't it another issue? And genomes are just playing a part in this story of so many facets of life. So I really would be interested in, what do you think this is, decoding life?
What is a very interesting question, even though, of course, you have no responsibility whatever for the panel title, which was picked by the organizers, much in the way that headlines are picked by people other than the writers of stories. But maybe you'd like to talk about the sense in which this has become part of the genomics discourse, the idea of decoding and its attached life.
I'll just offer one quick comment, which is that when I saw the title, I actually put a lot more emphasis on the twists and turns. And for me, what was interesting there are the contortions that we go through to either make sense of life or to evade things that we don't want to engage with. So I just wanted to say that for me, it was interesting, the emphasis. I actually almost didn't see the decoding part. I just, oh, twists and turns. I know what that's all about. So that was my take on it. George, you do decoding work.
Segue from the dance segment, which was about twists and turns in a different sense. But the very fact that Francoise didn't notice it, of course, suggests that that discourse is pretty normalized, and hence one doesn't see it. George.
Yeah, so I did see the word decoding because that's the subject of a lot of my work is literally the genetic code going and decoding and recoding. But I think what was meant here was a very artistic statement rather than a scientific one. I could be wrong. I didn't write the title, and it's not about decoding all of life or even a tiny fraction of it. It's what we can decode, the tiny fraction that we can decode. How does that empower us? How does that put us at risk? And the tiny part that we can sort of little bit decode is the relationship between a very serious disease and a single point mutation, A to a G, or changing that base pair in a microorganism or a plant or an animal, right? We know a few of those codes, but we don't know the whole code. And even if we did know the whole code, it wouldn't be all of life. Life is so much bigger than that. So I think we're kind of saying that little bit that's, of knowledge that we gained by eating the apple or whatever, however we got it, is already maybe too much power for us. That's my interpretation of the word decoding and life. Yeah.
Let me take two questions back there with Jim and then down here with David.
Thank you. Jim Keenan from Boston College. I have a question about social norms and the public square. I'm listening to Patrice, for instance, the 4 stages that you showed, how consensus changed in each of these 4 different moments, and how among professionals these insights were reached at different times in different ways. But I've also been hearing how Francois, you doomsdayer from 2012, or George, you just made those 4 points where in the public square, people have certain basic foundational arguments that are very different from one another and very culturally determined. Do you have any good news? Do you have any instances? Could you give us, each of you, one moment that you think that somehow our arguments entered the public square effectively, that somehow there was some understanding that occurred because of our discussions that entered into a fairly fragmented society that doesn't know how to listen? Just some hope.
While you're each thinking about good news, let me also take a question from David.
Thanks, David Winnicott from the OECD. My question is about, again, this challenge of encouraging debate of a certain kind that could sustain, build a kind of governance that we can both like or at least accept, and the challenges of doing that in what is kind of an arcane area. And my question is really based on personal experience in an organization that tends not to focus on ethics, and certainly not the ethics of technology. But my observation and my personal experience is that, and I wonder from your point of view, whether the artificial intelligence debate, which really has elevated, I think, the questions of technology governance to a more public level, whether that has either created a productive space for debates about the genome, and allowed and brought into view certain kinds of arguments that are being, where we're seeing reasoning about technology maybe in a way that we haven't seen? Or is it crowding out debates about genome? Because everything is AI all the time, and this is a existential threat and so forth. And the sense of crisis around AI is sort of maybe overshadowing a sense of urgency with the genome. So I wonder, from your perspective, is it a blessing in terms of democracy or kind of a curse?
Okay, so feel free to take on either or both questions, but who wants to begin with the gospel or good news?
I'll start because I actively work on artificial intelligence in my laboratory. Full disclosure, I'm part of a company called Lila.ai here in Cambridge. And I think the intersection of AI and genetics is one of the more successful ones. I think I'm unimpressed by the natural language processing. It tends to create and other things that the public sees mostly. They produce hallucinations and wordiness and whatnot. But when it intersected with protein design, we're actually making amazingly rapid progress that I think is mostly positive. So back to the question about good news, we've used AI plus to engineer genetic gene delivery vehicles so that they're 100 times more effective. That was done by one team in a very short period of time, in months. And it was and it was done in a way that was, I think, very humane for animals. So they had to test it in as close to a human as possible, which is primates, which are both expensive and subject, I think, to correct humane procedures. And they could test 1 million different drug constructs at once in one primate. So that spared, the unaffordable and inhumane clinical testing in millions of primate trials. So that's not to say that there isn't a danger of AI, either the danger of dominating the conversation or the danger of actually just taking us over before we get a chance to converse. But I do think that a lot of the AI that I see so far is not anywhere close to human intelligence level, but it might be a good time for us to start figuring out what we mean by ethics so that we can teach it to them soon.
I think that the fetishization of biology is one of the things you see here, right? Because I'll put forward the following claim, just to be provocative. My iPhone and Instagram are much, much more dangerous to society and much more profoundly transformative to society than heritable genome editing, even if it was happening at a large scale. That I think these technologies are incredibly disruptive and have basically changed the course of a generation. And guess what? Nobody really had pre-market clearance. Nobody had clinical trials. Nobody had review, because we just put them in this other bucket. And oh, by the way, the fact that these were mature companies that had lots of power, lots of lobbying, lots of ability to negotiate with governments and the like, put them in a different position very differently than the nascent emerging field of heritable genome editing, right? So to me, there's a way in which I find the fact that we put biology over here and social media over here a little mystifying if you're thinking about what needs regulation.
And sorry, I was just going to say it's a geography of fetish and fantasy, and the ability to create entities that you treat as though they're real is certainly affecting, lawyers, with the example of the man who testified after his decease in court. That you might have read about. A man in Arizona was shot and killed in a road rage accident. His sister put together a generated chatbot version of him, and he testified. And I feel it is creepy, but I suspect that in another year or two, it won't be so creepy. This way in which a younger generation is interacting with, they're falling in love with chatbots, but they're being used in ways that project visions of human potential in very much the same way that we fantasize about what we're going to do with the human genome. And so in that sense, I think they're connected. And it's, again, what I worry about both technologies when our president says that race is biological. And the people he has advising him through Project 2025 are people like Charles Murray, I'm sorry, who says that we haven't found it yet, or James Watson for that matter. We haven't found the difference yet. And that's what I heard when you were saying decode, in this title, that there are people who are determined to decode down to the difference that explains social divisions that have nothing to do with biology, but we seem so determined and so, so stuck in those fantasies that there is a biological explanation for this. And our president at this moment is expressing that as a social division. Race is biological, it's not a social construct, therefore we can tear apart the African American Art Museum. And that's, it seems to me that level of how we live these fetishes and fantasies far exceeds the biological impact of anything we're experimenting with in labs, but it is important.
Yeah, so I'd like to offer comments on both of those questions. I don't know if it's possible to put back up the slide that the one slide that I had, because I would like to draw your attention to that slide. And if not, yeah. So one of the things that I think is the good news story is look at the difference. Look at the trajectory between 2015, 2017, 2018, and 2023. And I kind of made the point that we're kind of pulling back in 2023. I think that's a good news story. And the good news story isn't because it aligns with my beliefs. I want to be really clear about that. The reason I think this is a good news story is that not me, but people who were on all four of those penned the last one. So that shows the possibility of not becoming entrenched in a worldview, because there are people who signed on to each of those four statements. And I think that's really great that you can change your mind over time. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And one of the things that I actually think somebody ought to do one day is to really pay attention to who was on which committee at which time. So I, disclosed where I was. I wasn't on all of them, but there are people who were on all of them. And it matters because I made the point that a lot of what happens in the world is about people, power, and politics. And I think that's a good news story, that people can shift. I think in response to your question about AI, there are a lot of places that have reported that the biggest challenge in the near future, depending on which report you read, as soon as next year or the year after, is not going to be any one particular technology, but it's going to be fear and concerns around misinformation and disinformation. And I think for me, why that ties into AI is there's a fair bit of power within that technology to change what gets presented as true. And for people to be AI ready has now become the term. And I don't even know what that means, but I see people saying we've got to train the next generation to be AI ready. And I think for me, what's challenging there is for people that want to think that, public discourse is important and conversations are important. Part of what we do is we rely on things we read and we come to believe are true, either by virtue of the source of the knowledge or not. And we make mistakes. And I just wonder how much of our information getting in the near future will be manipulated in ways that are more overt and intentional. That happens all the time. So I'm not pretending it's pristine now, but I wonder about that intersection with the technology, which will then affect our attitudes towards all technologies.
So I think that it's coming time to wrap up. And I just want to say a couple of words of my own from the standpoint of the observatory about what difference does it make that we have these conversations, and is it reflected in any kind of change? I mean, back of that is a theory of how discourse changes action or opinion. You as a self-discovered, somewhat later in life preacher, know yourself that, within oneself there may be capabilities that one hasn't actually articulated in the same way. So I think that fits with from what Francoise was saying about the gradual evolution of the social sphere. I would wonder whether people, how people in this room might analyze the progression from Roe v. Wade to Dobbs, for instance. So a lot of people, liberals included, thought that Roe was the right decision reached for the wrong reasons. And there's a huge law review literature arguing various versions of that story. I think that fits back into what we were saying before about consensus, that there can be agreement on outcome, but not agreement on the reasons, and many shades of that kind of thing. So from the standpoint of some in this country, Dobbs was the righting of wrong, that it is not good public reason to come to the right outcome for the wrong reason. And now here we have a second chance to re-reason our way through. So one finds in other countries, Supreme Court decisions and Constitutional Court decisions, similar turnarounds. For example, the prenatal genetic testing decision in Germany came out one way and then came out a different way because the basis for the reasoning, the reasoning that led to the outcome changed. So I think one does have particular pointed outcome-oriented differences that one can look at, but not necessarily a similar societal judgment that this was a good change necessarily. So I think that that is a discussion that we hope to keep having. But I think the observatory's theory of change is less billiard ball-like, that we take an action and it has a physical impact and then the balls skitter a different way. I think our vision is more that over time one cultivates a set of conversations, and I think that this is something, Francoise, that you were talking about. And if you look at our literature, we highlight this idea of conversation, which doesn't necessarily have to come to an end. And in that spirit, I would like to invite people to come to the reception and to continue the conversation with a stress on the con part of it together. We have approximately an hour of time over some hors d'oeuvre and other things outside over there. And then we will reconvene here at 7:30 to see this really extraordinary screening. And we have, as Ben has already announced, the benefit of a conversation between the author and one of our esteemed panelists in this program. So we'll reconvene here at 7:30 for the screening of Unspeakable Conversations. And in the meantime, please feel free to continue the conversation over a glass of something and a bite to eat. But let's first thank this panel for wonderful presentation.